International System of Units.
The International System of Units is the modern form of the metric system and is the world's most widely used system of measurement, used in both everyday commerce and science. It comprises a coherent system of units of measurement built around 7 base units, 22 named and an indeterminate number of unnamed coherent derived units, and a set of prefixes that act as decimal-based multipliers. The standards, published in 1960 as the result of an initiative started in 1948, are based on the meter-kilogram-second (MKS) system, rather than the centimeter-gram-second (CGS) system, which, in turn, had several variants. The SI has been declared to be an evolving system. Thus prefixes and units are created and unit definitions are modified through international agreement as the technology of measurement progresses and the precision of measurements improves. The driving force behind the development of the System International was the diversity of units that had sprung up within the CGS system of units and the lack of coordination between the various disciplines that made extensive use of units of measurement. In addition to defining a new realization of the metric system, the General Conference on Weights and Measures, an organization set up by the Convention of the Meter in 1875, succeeded in bringing together many international organizations to agree not only the definitions of the SI, but also rules on writing and presenting measurements in a standardized manner around the globe. The system has been adopted by most countries in the developed world, though within English-speaking countries, the adoption has not been universal. In the United States, metric units are not commonly used outside of science, medicine and the government. However, United States customary units are officially defined in terms of SI units. The United Kingdom has officially adopted a partial metrication policy, with no intention of replacing imperial units entirely. Canada has adopted it for most governmental and scientific purposes, but imperial units are still legally permitted and remain in common use throughout many sectors of Canadian society, particularly in the building trade and railway sectors.
History.
The metric system was first implemented during the French Revolution, 1790s, with just the meter and kilogram as standards of length and mass respectively. In the 1830s, Carl Friedrich Gauss laid the foundations for a coherent system based on length, mass and time. In the 1860s, a group working under the auspices of the British Association for the Advancement of Science formulated the requirement for a coherent system of units with base units and derived units. The inclusion of electrical units into the system was hampered by the customary use of more than one set of units, until 1900 when Giovanni Giorgi identified the need to define one single electrical quantity as a fourth base quantity alongside the original three base quantities. Meanwhile, in 1875, the Treaty of the Meter passed responsibility for verification of the kilogram and meter against agreed prototypes from French to international control. In 1921 the treaty was extended to include all physical quantities including electrical units originally defined in 1893. In 1948 an overhaul of the metric system was set in motion which resulted in the development of the practical system of units, which, on its publication in 1960, was given the name the International System of Units. In 1954 the 10th General Conference on Weights and Measures, CGPM, identified electric current as the fourth base quantity in the practical system of units and added two more base quantities, temperature and luminous intensity, making 6 base quantities in all. The units associated with these quantities were the meter, kilogram, second, ampere, degree Kelvin and candela. In 1971 a seventh base quantity, amount of substance represented by the mole, was added to the definition of SI.
Uncoordinated development.
The metric system was developed from 1791 onwards by a committee of the Académie des Sciences commissioned by the Assemblée Nationale and Louis XVI of France to create a unified and rational system of measures. The group, which included Antoine-Laurent Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry, and the mathematicians Pierre-Simon Laplace and Adrien-Marie Legendre, 89, used the principles for relating length, volume and mass that had been proposed by the English cleric John Wilkins in 1668, and the concept of using the Earth's meridian as the basis of the definition of length, originally proposed in 1670 by the French cleric Gabriel Mouton. On March 30, 1791, the Assembly adopted the principles proposed by Committee for the New Decimal System of Measure and authorized a survey between Dunkirk and Barcelona to establish the length of the meridian. On July 11, 1792, the committee proposed the names meter, ar, liter, and grave for the units of length, area, capacity and mass respectively. The committee also proposed that multiples and submultiples of these units were to be denoted by decimal-based prefixes such as centi to denote 100th, and kilo to denote 1082. The law of April 7, 1795, Loi du 18 Germinal, defined the terms gram and kilogram, which replaced the former terms gravit, correctly milligrave, and grave, and on June 22, 1799, after Pierre Macain and Jean-Baptiste Delambre completed the Meridian Survey, the definitive standards, the Meter des Archives and the Kilogramme des Archives were deposited in the Archives Nationales. On December 10, 1799, a month after Napoleon's coup d'état, the law by which the metric system was to be definitively adopted in France, Loi du 19 Frimaire, was passed. During the first half of the 19th century there was little consistency in the choice of preferred multiples of the base units. Typically the myriameter, 10,000 meters, was in widespread use in both France and parts of Germany, while the kilogram, 1,000 grams, rather than the myriagram was used for mass. In 1832 Carl Friedrich Gauss, assisted by Wilhelm Weber, implicitly defined the second as a base unit when he quoted the Earth's magnetic field in terms of millimeters, grams, and seconds. Prior to this, the strength of the Earth's magnetic field had only been described in relative terms. The technique used by Gauss was to equate the torque induced on a suspended magnet of known mass by the Earth's magnetic field with the torque induced on an equivalent system under gravity. The resultant calculations enabled him to assign dimensions based on mass, length and time to the magnetic field. In the 1860s James Clerk Maxwell, William Thomson, later Lord Kelvin, and others working under the auspices of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, built on Gauss' work and formalized the concept of a coherent system of units with base units and derived units. The principle of coherence was successfully used to define a number of units of measure based on the centimeter-gram-second (CGS) system of units, CGS, including the erg for energy, the dyne for force, the bary for pressure, the poise for dynamic viscosity and the Stokes for kinematic viscosity.
Meter Convention.
A French-inspired initiative for international cooperation in metrology led to the signing in 1875 of the Meter Convention 353-354. Initially the convention only covered standards for the meter and the kilogram. A set of 30 prototypes of the meter and 40 prototypes of the kilogram, in each case made of a 90% platinum 10% iridium alloy, were manufactured by the British firm Johnson, Matthey and Company and accepted by the CGPM in 1889. One of each was selected at random to become the International Prototype Meter and International Prototype Kilogram that replaced the Meter des Archives and Kilogramme des Archives respectively. Each member state was entitled to one of each of the remaining prototypes to serve as the national prototype for that country. The treaty established 3 international organizations to oversee the keeping of international standards of measurement. General Conference on Weights and Measures, Conference Générale des Poids et Mesures or CGPM, a meeting every 4 to 6 years of delegates from all member states that receives and discusses a report from the CIPM and that endorses new developments in the SI on the advice of the CIPM, International Committee for Weights and Measures. Comet International des Poids et Mesures or CIPM, a committee that meets annually at the BIPM and is made up of 18 individuals of high scientific standing, nominated by the CGPM to advise the CGPM on administrative and technical matters. International Bureau of Weights and Measures, Bureau International des Poids et Mesures or BIPM, an international metrology center at Sèvres in France that is custody of the international prototype kilogram, provides metrology services for the CGPM and CIPM, houses the secretariat for these organizations and hosts their formal meetings. Initially its prime metrological purpose was at periodic recalibration of national prototype meters and kilograms against the international prototype. In 1921 the meter convention was extended to include all physical units, including the ampere and others defined by the Fourth International Conference of Electricians in Chicago in 1893, thereby enabling the CGPM to address inconsistencies in the way that the metric system had been used. 96. The official language of the meter convention is French and the definitive version of all official documents published by or on behalf of the CGPM is the French language version. 94.
Towards SI.
At the close of the 19th century 3 different systems of units of measure existed for electrical measurements, a CGS-based system for electrostatic units, also known as the Gaussian or ESU system, a CGS-based system for electromechanical units, EMU, and an MKS-based system, the International System for Electrical Distribution Systems. Attempts to resolve the electrical units in terms of length, mass and time using dimensional analysis was beset with difficulties. The dimensions depended on whether one used the ESU or EMU systems. This anomaly was resolved in 1900 when Giovanni Giorgi published a paper in which he advocated using a fourth base unit alongside the existing 3 base units. The fourth unit could be chosen to be either electric current or voltage or electrical resistance. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries a number of non-coherent units of measure based on the gram per kilogram, the centimeter per meter and the second, such as the Ferdstach, metric horsepower, for power, the Darcy for permeability and the use of millimeters of mercury for the measurement of both barometric and blood pressure were developed or propagated. All these units incorporate standard gravity in their definitions. At the end of the Second World War, a number of different systems of measurement were in use throughout the world. Some of these systems were metric system variations, whereas others were based on customary systems of measure. After representations by the International Union of Pure and Applied Physics, IUPAP, and by the French government, the Ninth General Conference on Weights and Measures, CGPM, in 1948, asked the International Committee for Weights and Measures, CIPM, to conduct an international study of the measurement needs of the scientific, technical, and educational communities and to make recommendations for a single practical system of units of measurement, suitable for adoption by all countries adhering to the meter convention. On the basis of the findings of this study, the 10th CGPM in 1954 decided that an international system should be derived from 6 base units to provide for the measurement of temperature and optical radiation in addition to mechanical and electromagnetic quantities. 6 base units were recommended: the meter, kilogram, second, ampere, degree Kelvin, later renamed Kelvin, and candela. In 1960, the 11th CGPM named the system the International System of Units, abbreviated SI from the French name, Le Système International d'Unités 110. The BIPM has also described SI as the modern metric system. 95. The 7th base unit, the mole, was added in 1971 by the 14th CGPM.
SI brochure and conversion factors.
The CGPM have published a brochure, the 8th edition of which appeared in 2006, in which the various recommendations that make up SI have been codified. The official version of the brochure, in line with the provisions of the meter convention, is the French version 102. This brochure leaves some scope for local interpretation, particularly in respect of language. The United States National Institute of Standards and Technology has produced a version of the CGPM document, NIST-SP 330, which clarifies local interpretation for English-language publications that use American English, and another document, NIST-SP 811, that gives general guidance for the use of SI in the United States. The writing and maintenance of the CGPM brochure is carried out by one of the consultative committees of the International Committee for Weights and Measures, CIPM, the Consultative Committee for Units, CCU. The CIPM nominates the chairman of this committee, and the committee includes representatives of various other international bodies rather than CIPM or CGPM nominees. This committee also provides a forum for the bodies concerned to provide input to the CIPM in respect of ongoing enhancements to SI. In 2010 the CCU proposed a number of changes to the definitions of the base units used in SI. The CIPM meeting of October 2010 found that the proposal was not complete, and it is expected that the CGPM will consider the full proposal in 2014. The definitions of the terms quantity, unit, dimension etc. that are used in the SI brochure are those given in the International Vocabulary of Metrology, a publication produced by the Joint Committee for Guides in Metrology, JCGM, a working group consisting of 8 international standards organizations under the chairmanship of the director of the BIPM. The quantities and equations that define the SI units are now referred to as the International System of Quantities, ISQ, and are set out in the ISO IEC 80000 Quantities and Units. Appendix B of NIST SP 811, a list of conversion factors between SI and customary units, is an extension to the SI brochure.
Units and prefixes.
The International System of Units consists of a set of base units, a set of derived units with special names, and a set of decimal-based multipliers that are used as prefixes. The term SI units includes all 3 categories, but the term coherent SI units includes only base units and coherent derived units 103 to 106.
Base units.
Base units are the building blocks of SI, all other units of measure can be derived from the base units. When Maxwell first introduced the concept of a coherent system, he identified 3 quantities that could be used as base units: mass, length and time. Georgi later identified the need for an electrical base unit, theoretically electrical current, potential difference, electrical resistance, electrical charge, or any one of a number of other units could have been used as the base unit, with the remaining units being then defined by the laws of physics. The unit of electric current was chosen for SI. The remaining 3 base units were added later.
Derived units.
Derived units are formed by powers, products or quotients of the base units and are unlimited in number. 103 derived units are associated with derived quantities, for example velocity is a quantity that is derived from the base quantities of time and distance which, in SI, has the dimensions meters per second, symbol meter per second. The dimensions of derived units can be expressed in terms of the dimensions of the base units. Coherent units are derived units that contain no numerical factor other than 1. Quantities such as standard gravity and density of water are absent from their definitions. In the example above, 1 Newton is the force required to accelerate a mass of 1 kg by 1 meter per second squared. Since the SI units of mass and acceleration are kg and m. S. 2 respectively and f. mxa, the units of force, and hence of newtons, is formed by multiplication to give kg. m. S. 2. Since the newton is part of a coherent set of units, the constant of proportionality is 1. For the sake of convenience, some derived units have special names and symbols. Such units may themselves be used in combination with the names and symbols for base units and for other derived units to express the units of other derived quantities. For example, the SI unit of force is the newton, N. The SI unit of pressure is the pascal, Pa, and the pascal can be defined as newtons per square meter, nm2.
Prefixes.
Prefixes are added to unit names to produce multiple and submultiples of the original unit. All multiples are integer powers of 10, and above 100 or below 100 all are integer powers of 1000. For example, kilo denotes a multiple of 1000 and milli denotes a multiple of 1000th. Hence there are 1000 millimeters to the meter and 1000 meters to the kilometer. The prefixes are never combined, and multiples of the kilogram are named as if the gram were the base unit. Thus a millionth of a meter is a micrometer, not a millimillimeter, and a millionth of a kilogram is a milligram, not a microkilogram. 122.14.
Non-SI units accepted for use with SI.
Although, in theory, SI can be used for any physical measurement, the CIPM has recognized that some non-SI units still appear in the scientific, technical and commercial literature, and will continue to be used for many years to come. In addition, certain other units are so deeply embedded in the history and culture of the human race that they will continue to be used for the foreseeable future. They have catalogued a number of such non-SI units accepted for use with SI and published them in the SI brochure, thereby ensuring that their use is consistent across the globe. These units have been grouped as follows: 123 to 129, 7 to 11. Non-SI units accepted for use with the SI, Table 6. Non-SI units whose values in SI units must be obtained experimentally, Table 7. Other non-SI units, Table 8. Non-SI units associated with the CGS and the CGS Gaussian system of units, Table 9.
Writing unit symbols and the values of quantities.
Before 1948, the writing of metric quantities was haphazard. In 1879, the CIPM published recommendations for writing the symbols for length, area, volume and mass, but it was outside its domain to publish recommendations for other quantities. Beginning in about 1900, physicists who had been using the symbol M for micrometer, or micron, L for microliter, and G for microgram started to use the symbols m, ml, and mg, but it was only in 1935, a decade after the revision of the meter convention, that the CIPM formally adopted this proposal and recommended that the symbol m be used universally as a prefix for 10. 6. In 1948, the 9th CGPM approved the first formal recommendation for the writing of symbols in the metric system when the basis of the rules as they are now known was laid down. These rules were subsequently extended by International Organization for Standardization, ISO, and the International Electrotechnical Commission, IEC, and now cover unit symbols and names, prefix symbols and names, how quantity symbols should be written and used, and how the values of quantities should be expressed. 104,130. Both ISO and the IEC have published rules for the presentation of SI units that are generally compatible with those published in the SI brochure. As of August 2013, ISO and IEC were in the process of merging their standards for quantities and units into a single set of compatible documents identified as the ISO-IEC 80000 standard. The rules covering printing of quantities and units are part of ISO 80000-1 2009.
Unit names.
Names of units follow the grammatical rules associated with common nouns. In English and in French they start with a lowercase letter, for example, Newton, Hertz, Pascal, even when the symbol for the unit begins with a capital letter. This also applies to degrees Celsius, since degree is the unit. In German, however, the names of units, as with all German nouns, start with capital letters. The spelling of unit names is a matter for the guardians of the language concerned. The official British and American spellings for certain SI units differ. British English uses the spelling deca, meter, and liter, whereas American English uses the spelling deca, meter, and liter, respectively. Likewise, the plural forms of units follow the grammar of the language concerned. In English, the normal rules of English grammar are used, for example, Henry's is the plural of Henry 31. However, the units lux, hertz, and Siemens have irregular plurals in that they remain the same in both their singular and plural form. In English, when unit names are combined to denote multiplication of the units concerned, they are separated with a hyphen or a space, for example Newton meter or Newton meter. The plural is formed by converting the last unit name to the plural form, for example 10 Newton meters.
Unit names as adjectives.
In English, a space is recommended between the number and the unit symbol when used as an adjective, for example a 25 kg sphere. The normal rules of English apply to unit names, where a hyphen is incorporated into the adjectival sense, for example a 25 kilogram sphere.
Chinese and Japanese.
Chinese uses traditional logograms for writing the unit names, while in Japanese unit names are written in the phonetic katakana script. In both cases symbols are written using the internationally recognized Latin and Greek characters. A set of characters representing various metric units was created in Japan in the late 19th century. Characters exist for three base units, the meter, mi, liter, sheng, and gram, k. These were combined with a set of 6 prefix characters, kilo, kian, hecto, bai, deca, shi, deci, fen, centi, li, and milli, mao, to form an additional 18 single-character units. The 7 length units, kilometer to millimeter, for example, are kian, bai, fan, mi, fen, li and li. These characters, however, are not in common use today. Instead, units are written out in katakana, the Japanese syllabary used for foreign borrowings, such as kairam-toru for kilometer. A few Sino-Japanese words for these units remain in use in Japanese, most significantly ping-mihai by square meter, but otherwise borrowed pronunciations are used. These characters are examples of the rare phenomenon of single-character loan words, a foreign word represented by a single Japanese character, and form the plurality of such words. Similar characters were also coined for other units, such as British units, though these also have fallen out of use. See single-character garigo, metric units and single-character garigo, other units for a full list. The basic units are meter, mi, liter, sheng, gram, kk, and second, myo, while others include watt, wa. Prefixes include deci, fen, centi, li, milli, how, micro, wi, and kilo, kian. These are combined to form disyllabic characters, such as li mi limi centimeter or kian waklanwa kilowatt. In the 19th century various compound characters were also used, similar to Japanese either imported or formed on the same principles, such as kian for kian waklanwa, kilowatt, or li for limi. These are generally not used today, for example centimeters is usually written li mi limi, but are occasionally found in older or technical writing.
Unit symbols and the values of quantities.
Although the writing of unit names is language-specific, the writing of unit symbols and the values of quantities is consistent across all languages and therefore the SI brochure has specific rules in respect of writing them. 130 to 135. The guideline produced by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, clarifies language-specific areas in respect of American English that were left open by the SI brochure, but is otherwise identical to the SI brochure.
General rules.
General rules for writing SI units and quantities apply to text that is either handwritten or produced using an automated process. The value of a quantity is written as a number followed by a space, representing a multiplication sign, and a unit symbol. For example, 2.21 kilograms, 7.3x102 m2, 22 k. This rule explicitly includes the percent sign, %134 and a symbol for degrees of temperature, DEGC. 133 exceptions are the symbols for plain angular degrees, minutes, and seconds, deg, and, which are placed immediately after the number with no intervening space. Symbols are mathematical entities, not abbreviations, and as such do not have an appended period full stop. Unless the rules of grammar demand one for another reason, such as denoting the end of a sentence, a prefix is part of the unit, and its symbol is prepended to the unit symbol without a separator, for example, K in km, M in mpa, G in ghz. Compound prefixes are not allowed. Symbols for derived units formed by multiplication are joined with a center dot, or a non-breaking space. For example, nm or nm. Symbols for derived units formed by division are joined with a solidus, slash, or given as a negative exponent. For example, the meter per second can be written meter per second, ms. 1, ms. 1, or ms. only one solidus should be used. For example, kg/ms2, and kilogram by meter. 1s. 2 are acceptable, but kilogram per meter s2 is ambiguous and unacceptable. The first letter of symbols for units derived from the name of a person is written in uppercase. Otherwise, they are written in lowercase. For example, the unit of pressure is named after Blaise Pascal, so its symbol is written par, but the symbol for mole is written mol. Thus, T is the symbol for Tesla, a measure of magnetic field strength, and T the symbol for ton, a measure of mass. Since 1979, the liter may exceptionally be written using either an uppercase L, or a lowercase l, a decision prompted by the similarity of the lowercase letter L to the numeral 1, especially with certain typefaces or English-style handwriting. The American NIST recommends that within the United States L be used rather than L. Symbols of units do not have a plural form. For example, 25 kilograms, not 25 kgs, uppercase and lowercase prefixes are not interchangeable. For example, the quantities 1 megawatt and 1 MW represent two different quantities. The former is the typical power requirement of a hearing aid, 1 milliwatt or 0.001 watts, and the latter the typical power requirement of a suburban train, 1 megawatt or 1 million watts. The 10th resolution of CGPM in 2003 declared that the symbol for the decimal marker shall be either the point on the line or the comma on the line. In practice, the decimal point is used in English-speaking countries and most of Asia, and the comma in most of Latin America and in continental European languages. Spaces should be used as a thousands separator, 1 million, in contrast to commas or periods, 1 million or 1.000.000, to reduce confusion resulting from the variation between these forms in different countries. Any line break inside a number, inside a compound unit, or between number and unit should be avoided. Where this is not possible, line breaks should coincide with thousands separators. Since the value of billion and trillion can vary from language to language, the dimensionless terms ppb, parts per billion, and ppt, parts per trillion, should be avoided. However, no alternative is suggested in the SI brochure.
Printing SI symbols.
Further rules are specified in respect of production of text using printing presses, word processors, typewriters and the like. Symbols are written in upright, Roman, type, M for meters, S for seconds, so as to differentiate from the italic type used for quantities, M for mass, S for displacement. By consensus of international standards bodies, this rule is applied independent of the font used for surrounding text. In Chinese, Japanese, and Korean language computing, CJK, some of the commonly used units, prefix unit combinations, or unit exponent combinations have been allocated predefined single characters taking up a full square. Unicode includes these in its CJK compatibility and letter-like symbol sub-ranges for back compatibility, without necessarily recommending future usage. These are summarized in Unicode symbols. The cursive, a letter-like symbol, has been used in a number of countries in addition to China and Japan as a symbol for the liter, but this is not currently recommended by any standards body. In print, the space used as a thousands separator, commonly called a thin space, is typically narrower than that used between words.
Realization of units.
Metrologists carefully distinguish between the definition of a unit and its realization. The definition of each base unit of the SI is drawn up so that it is unique and provides a sound theoretical basis on which the most accurate and reproducible measurements can be made. The realization of the definition of a unit is the procedure by which the definition may be used to establish the value and associated uncertainty of a quantity of the same kind as the unit. A description of the mise en pratique of the base units is given in an electronic appendix to the SI brochure 168-169. The published mise en pratique is not the only way in which a base unit can be determined. The SI brochure states that any method consistent with the laws of physics could be used to realize any SI unit. 111 in the current, 2012, exercise to overhaul the definitions of the base units, various consultative committees of the CIPM have required that more than one meson pratique shall be developed for determining the value of each unit. In particular, at least 3 separate experiments be carried out yielding values having a relative standard uncertainty in the determination of the kilogram of no more than 5x10. 8 and at least one of these values should be better than 2x10. 8. Both the Watt balance and the Avogadro project should be included in the experiments and any differences between these be reconciled. When the Kelvin is being determined, the relative uncertainty of the Boltzmann constant derived from 2 fundamentally different methods such as acoustic gas thermometry and dielectric constant gas thermometry be better than 1 part in 10. 6 and that these values be corroborated by other measurements.
Post-1960 changes.
The preamble to the meter convention read desiring the international uniformity and precision in standards of weight and measure, have resolved to conclude a convention. Changing technology has led to an evolution of the definitions and standards that has followed 2 principal strands, changes to SI itself and clarification of how to use units of measure that are not part of SI, but are still nevertheless used on a worldwide basis.
Changes to the SI.
Since 1960 the CGPM has made a number of changes to SI. These include the 13th CGPM, 1967, renamed the degree Kelvin, symbol DEGK, to the Kelvin, symbol K, 156. The 14th CGPM, 1971, added the mole, symbol mol, to the list of base units. The 14th GCPM, 1971, added the Pascal, symbol par, for pressure and the Siemens, symbol S, for electrical conductance to the list of named derived units 156. The 15th CGPM, 1975, added the becquerel, symbol becquerel, for activity referred to a radionuclide, and the Gray, symbol Gray, for ionizing radiation to the list of named derived units, 156, in order to distinguish between absorbed dose, and dose equivalent. The 16th CGPM, 1979, added the sievert, symbol sievert, to the list of named derived units as the unit of dose equivalent 158. The 16th CGPM, 1979, clarified that in a break with convention either the letter L, or the letter L may be used as a symbol for the liter 159. The 21st CGPM, 1999, added the cattle, symbol cat, for catalytic activity to the list of named derived units 165. In its original form, 1960, the SI defined prefixes for values ranging from pico, symbol P, having a value of 10. 12 to tera, symbol T, having a value of 1012. The list was extended at the 12th CGPM, 1964, 152 at the 15th CGPM, 1975, 158 and at the 19th CGPM, 1991, 164 to give the current range of prefixes. In addition, advantage was taken of developments in technology to redefine many of the base units, enabling the use of higher precision techniques.
Retention of non-SI units.
Although, in theory, SI can be used for any physical measurement, it is recognized that some non-SI units still appear in the scientific, technical and commercial literature, and will continue to be used for many years to come. In addition, certain other units are so deeply embedded in the history and culture of the human race that they will continue to be used for the foreseeable future. The CIPM has catalogued such units and included them in the SI brochure so that they can be used consistently. The first such group comprises the units of time and of angles and certain legacy non-SI metric units. Most of mankind has used the day and its subdivisions as a basis of time, with the result that the second, minute, hour and day, unlike the foot or the pound, were the same regardless of where it was being measured. The second has been catalogued as an SI unit, its multiples as units of measure that may be used alongside the SI. The measurement of angles has likewise had a long history of consistent use, the radian, being 1/2 p of a revolution, has mathematical niceties, but it is cumbersome for navigation, hence the retention of the degree, minute and second of arc. The ton, litre and hectare were adopted by the CGPM in 1879 and have been retained as units that may be used alongside SI units, having been given unique symbols. Physicists often use units of measure that are based on natural phenomena such as the speed of light, the mass of a proton, approximately 1 Dalton, the charge of an electron and the like. These too have been catalogued in the SI brochure with consistent symbols, but with the caveat that their physical values need to be measured. In the interests of standardizing health-related units of measure used in the nuclear industry, the 12th CGPM, 1964, accepted the continued use of the Curie symbol psi as a non-SI unit of activity for radionuclides. 152 The becquerel, civet and Gray were adopted in later years. Similarly, the millimeter of mercury, symbol mHg, was retained for measuring blood pressure. 127.
Global adoption of SI.
SI has become the world's most widely used system of measurement, used in both everyday commerce and science. The change to SI had little effect on everyday life in countries that used the metric system. The meter, kilogram, litre and second remained unchanged, as did the way in which they were used. Most of the changes only affected measurements in the workplace. The CGPM has a role of recommending changes, but no formal role in the enforcement of such changes. Another intergovernmental organization, the International Organization of Legal Metrology, OIML, provides a forum for harmonization of national standards and legislation in respect of metrology. Both the degree and rate of adoption of SI varied from country to country. Countries that had not adopted the metric system by 1960 and subsequently adopted SI did so directly as part of their metrication programs, while others migrated from the CGS system of units to SI. In 1960, the world's largest economy was that of the United States, followed by the United Kingdom, West Germany, France, Japan, China and India. The United States and the United Kingdom were non-metric. France and Germany had been using the metric system for about a century, and China had been using the metric system for 35 years, while India and Japan had adopted the metric system within the preceding 5 years. Other non-metric countries were those where the United Kingdom or the United States had considerable influence. These differences are brought out in the examples below.
United Kingdom and the former Empire.
Even though the use of metric units was legalised for trade in the UK in 1864, the UK had signed the Metre Convention in 1884 and the UK Parliament had defined the yard and the pound in terms of the metre and the kilogram in 1897, the UK continued to use the imperial system of measure and to export the imperial system of units to the Empire. In 1932, the system of imperial preference was set up at the Ottawa Conference. Although Ireland left the Commonwealth in 1948 and South Africa in 1961, both continued their close economic ties with the Commonwealth. When the SI standard was published in 1960, the only major Commonwealth country to have adopted the metric system was India. In 1863, the first reading of a bill that would have made the metric system compulsory passed its first reading in the House of Commons by 110 votes to 75. The bill, however, failed to make the statute book because of lack of parliamentary time. 136 in 1965. After this and similar false starts, the then Federation of British Industry informed the British government that its members favoured the adoption of the metric system. The rationale behind the request was that 80% of British exports were to countries that used the metric system or that were considering changing to the metric system. The Board of Trade, on behalf of the government, agreed to support a 10-year metrication program. The government agreed to a voluntary policy requiring minimal legislation and costs to be borne where they fell. SI would be used from the outset. The rest of the Commonwealth, South Africa and Ireland followed within a few years. In some countries such as South Africa and Australia, metrication was mandatory rather than voluntary. By 1980, all apart from the United Kingdom, Canada and Ireland had effectively completed their programs. In the United Kingdom, the breakdown of voluntary metrication in the mid-1970s, SS 1.8 coincided with the United Kingdom's obligations as part of the EEC to adopt the metric system, resulting in legislation to force metrication in certain areas and the Eurosceptic movement adopting an anti-metrication stance and the United Kingdom seeking a number of derogations from the relevant EEC directives. Once the metrication of most consumer goods was completed in 2000, aspects of British life, especially in government, commerce and industry used SI. SS 1.6 and SS 1.10. Although SI or units approved for use alongside SI are used in most areas where units of measure are regulated, imperial units are widely encountered in unregulated areas such as the press and everyday speech. Canada has adopted it for most purposes, but imperial units are still legally permitted and remain in common use throughout a few sectors of Canadian society, particularly in the buildings, trades and railways sectors. The situation in Ireland, apart from road signs which were metricated in the early 2000s, is similar to that in the United Kingdom.
United States.
Even though Congress set up a framework for the use of the metric system in the 19th century, the United States continues to use customary units for most purposes apart from science and medicine, though as a result of their Spanish heritage, metric units are used widely in Puerto Rico. On February 10, 1964, the National Bureau of Standards, now the National Institute of Standards and Technology, issued a statement that it was to use SI except where this would have an obvious detrimental effect. In 1968, Congress authorized the U.S. metric study, the emphasis of which was to examine the feasibility of adopting SI. The first volume was delivered in 1970. The study recommended that the United States adopt the International System of Units, and in 1975 Congress passed the Metric Conversion Act of 1975, which established a national policy of coordinating and planning for the increased use of the metric measurement system in the United States. Metrication was voluntary and to be coordinated by United States Metric Board, USMB. Efforts during the Ford and Carter administrations to force metrication was seized on by many newspaper editorialists as being dictatorial. 365 public response included resistance, apathy, and sometimes ridicule. The underlying reasons for this response include a relative uniformity of weights and measures inherited from the United Kingdom in 1776, a homogeneous economy, and the influence of business groups and populists in Congress caused the country to look at the short-term costs associated with the changeover, particularly those that would be borne by the consumer rather than long-term benefits of efficiency and international trade. The Metrication Board was disbanded in 1982, 362 to 365. The 1988 Omnibus Foreign Trade and Competitiveness Act removed international trade barriers and amended the Metric Conversion Act of 1975, designating the metric system as the preferred system of weights and measures for United States trade and commerce. The legislation stated that the federal government has a responsibility to assist industry, especially small business, as it voluntarily converts to the metric system of measurement. Exceptions were made for the highway and construction industries. The Department of Transportation planned to require metric units by 2000, but this plan was cancelled by the 1998 Highway Bill TEA 21. However, the U.S. military uses the metric system widely, partly because of the need to work with armed services from other nations. Although overall responsibility for labeling requirements of consumer goods lies with Congress and is therefore covered by federal law, details of labeling requirements for certain commodities are controlled by state law or by other authorities such as the Food and Drug Administration, Environmental Protection Agency and Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau. The Federal Fair Packaging and Labeling Act, FPLA, originally passed in 1964, was amended in 1992 to require consumer goods directly under its jurisdiction to be labeled in both customary and metric units. Some industries are engaged in efforts to amend this law to allow manufacturers to use only metric labeling. The National Conference on Weights and Measures has developed the Uniform Packaging and Labeling Regulations, UPLR, which provides a standard approach to those sections of packaging law that are under state control. Acceptance of the UPLR varies from state to state. 14 states accept it by merely citing it in their legislation. During the first decade of the 21st century, the EU Directive 80/181/EC had required the dual unit labelling of goods sold within the EU cease by the end of 2009. This was backed up by requests from other nations including Japan and New Zealand to permit metric-only labelling as an aid to trade with those countries. Opinion in the United States was split. A bill to permit metric-only labeling at the federal level was to have been introduced in 2005, but significant opposition from the Food Marketing Institute, representing U.S. grocers, has delayed the introduction of the bill. During a routine decennial review of the directive in 2008, the EU postponed the sunset clause for dual units indefinitely. Meanwhile, in 1999 the UPLR was amended to permit metric-only labeling and automatically became law in those states that accept UPLR as is. By January 1, 2009, 48 out of 50 states permit metric-only labeling either through UPLR or through their own legislation. As of February 2013 the use of metric, and therefore SI, units in the United States does not follow any pattern. Dual unit labeling on consumer goods is mandatory. Some consumer goods such as soft drinks are sold in metric quantities, others such as milk are sold in customary units. The engineering industry is equally split. The automotive industry is largely metric, but aircraft such as the Boeing 787 Dreamliner were designed using customary units.
European Union.
In 1960, all the largest industrialized nations that had an established history of using the metric system were members of the European Economic Community, EEC. In 1972, in order to harmonize units of measure as part of a program to facilitate trade between member states, the EEC issued Directive 71/354/EEC. This directive catalogued units of measure that could be used for economic, public health, public safety and administrative purposes, and also provided instructions for a transition from the existing units of measure that were in use. The directive replicated the CGPMSI recommendations and in addition preempted some of the additions whose use had been recommended by the CIPM in 1969, but had not been ratified by the CGPM. The directive also catalogued units of measure whose status would be reviewed by the end of 1977, mainly coherent CGS units of measure, and also catalogued units of measure that were to be phased out by the end of 1977, including the use of obsolete names for the sale of timber such as the steer, the use of units of force and pressure that made use of the acceleration due to gravity, the use of non-coherent units of power such as the Ferdstach, PS, the use of the calorie as a measure of energy and the Stalb as a measure of luminance. The directive was silent in respect of units that were specific to one or two countries including the pond, fund, livre, Dutch, German and French synonyms for 500G, thereby effectively prohibiting their use as well. When the directive was revisited during 1977, some of the older units that were being reviewed, such as millimeter of mercury for blood pressure, were retained but others were phased out, thereby broadly aligning the allowable units with SI. The directive was however overhauled to accommodate British and Irish interests in retaining the imperial system in certain circumstances. It was reissued as Directive 80/181/EEC. During subsequent revisions, the directive has reflected changes in the definition of SI. The directive also formalized the use of supplementary units, which in 1979 were permitted for a period of 10 years. The cut-off date for the use of supplementary units was extended a number of times and in 2009 was extended indefinitely.
India.
India was one of the last countries to start a metrication program before the advent of SI. When it became independent in 1947, both imperial and native units of measure were in use. Its metrication program started in 1956 with the passing of the Standards of Weights and Measures Act. Part of the Act fixed the value of the seer, a legacy unit of mass, to 0.9331 kilograms exactly. Elsewhere the Act declared that from 1960 all non-metric units of measure were to be illegal. 4 years after the Indian government announced its metrication program, SI was published. The result was that the initial metrication program was a conversion to the CGS system of units, and the subsequent adoption of SI has been haphazard. 50 years later, many of the country's schoolbooks still use CGS or imperial units. Originally, the Indian government had planned to replace all units of measure with metric units by 1960. In 1976, a new Weights and Measures Act replaced the 1956 Act, which, amongst other things, required that all weighing devices be approved before being released onto the marketplace. However, in 2012, it was reported that traditional units were still encountered in small manufacturing establishments and in the marketplace alongside CGS, SI and imperial measures, particularly in the poorer areas. The use of the Indian numbering system of crores, 10 million and lakhs, 100,000, which do not map onto the SI system of prefixes, is widespread and is often found alongside or in place of the Western numbering system.
New SI.
When the meter was redefined in 1960, the kilogram was the only SI base unit that relied on a specific artifact, and thus the only unit that was subject to periodic comparisons of national standards with the international prototypes. After the 1996 to 1998 recalibration, a clear divergence between the various prototype kilograms was observed. At its 23rd meeting, 2007, the CGPM mandated the CIPM to investigate the use of natural constants of nature as the basis for all units of measure rather than the artifacts that were then in use, thus involving a change from explicit unit definitions to explicit constant definitions. At a meeting of the CCU held in Reading, United Kingdom, in September 2010, a resolution and draft changes to the SI brochure that were to be presented to the next meeting of the CIPM in October 2010 were agreed to in principle. The proposals that the CCU put forward were: in addition to the speed of light, 4 constants of nature, the Planck constant, an elementary charge, the Boltzmann constant and the Avogadro number, be defined to have exact values, the international prototype kilogram be retired, the current definitions of the kilogram, ampere, Kelvin and mole be revised, the wording of the definitions of all the base units be both tightened up and changed to reflect the change in emphasis from explicit unity to explicit constant definitions. The CIPM meeting of October 2010 found that the conditions set by the General Conference at its 23rd meeting have not yet been fully met. For this reason, the CIPM does not propose a revision of the SI at the present time. The CIPM did however sponsor a resolution at the 24th CGPM in which the changes were agreed to in principle and which were expected to be finalized at the CGPM's next meeting in 2014.